General Briefing Paper, Section 35, Rights and the One Canadian Economy Act, C5. Date, July 2025. First Nations Strategic Response to National Interest Projects and C5. 1. Background: Canada is advancing major infrastructure and resource development initiatives described as national interest projects under the proposed One Canadian Economy Act, Bill C5. These projects aim to streamline development and interprovincial trade, placing emphasis on economic unity and efficiency. Many of these projects are expected to fall under provincial jurisdiction: natural resources, energy, infrastructure, land use. Bill C5 is viewed by some as a legislative strategy to reduce federal oversight and limit delays caused by Indigenous rights assertions, environmental reviews, or jurisdictional disputes. This creates urgent concerns for First Nations rights protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982. 2. Section 35 Rights, Legal Standing. Section 35(1) of the Constitution Act, 1982 recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. These include First Nations status and non-status Indians, Métis, Inuit. However, the nature, scope, and content of those rights as they existed on April 17, 1982, the constitutional reference date, are often undefined or contested. The courts have stated these rights must be proven, negotiated, or litigated to be fully protected or enforced. 3. Key legal and political considerations. A. Royal Proclamation of 1763 applies primarily to First Nations. Recognized Aboriginal title and land rights, which formed the basis for historic and modern treaties, does not apply to the Métis or Inuit in the same legal way. Strengthens the legal foundation of treaty and title-based First Nations rights over other Aboriginal claims in many regions. B. Differentiation. Within Section 35(2), while Section 35(2) includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, their historical legal foundations differ. It is critical that each group define and identify their Section 35 rights as they existed on April 17, 1982. The inclusion of other Aboriginal groups at project consultation tables must not dilute treaty-based or title-based First Nations rights. C. Federal versus provincial jurisdiction. Roughly 80 to 90% of development projects are under provincial jurisdiction, per Section 92 of the Constitution. However, the federal government retains constitutional obligations under Section 91(24), Indians and lands reserved for Indians. The duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples remains a federal constitutional requirement, regardless of who has jurisdiction over the project. D. C5 and the risk of federal abdication. If Bill C5 is used to minimize federal oversight or transfer authority to provinces without upholding Section 35 obligations, it may be unconstitutional. Any attempt to use economic urgency to bypass consultation obligations may be subject to legal challenge. 4th, strategic recommendations. A. Demand a Section 35 rights framework. All First Nation must assert and affirm their sovereignty and Aboriginal title over their territory, lands and waters, and their citizens. All First Nations must insist that federal and provincial governments identify, define, and recognize First Nations Section 35 rights as of April 17, 1982. Negotiate a First Nations Section 35 rights framework with clear scope of rights, implementation strategy, timelines for enforcement and recognition. This framework should become a mandatory precondition if there is to be any support any aspect of C5 or related projects. B. Require distinct rights tables. If the government includes Métis or Inuit in negotiations, they must be required to define their own Section 35 rights First Nations should not be grouped with other Section 35(2) Aboriginal groups unless rights are legally equivalent and affirmed. C. Hold Canada accountable. The federal government cannot offload its constitutional responsibilities to provinces through legislation or political arrangements. First Nations must be prepared to challenge C5 constitutionally if it bypasses fiduciary duties, engage with courts to assert Crown obligations under Haida Nation, Delgamuukw, Tsilhqot'in, and related precedents. D. Political unity and assertion. First Nations must remain united and firm. No national interest project should proceed without formal accommodation of rights and frameworks in place. Do not allow the promise of short-term benefits or funding to substitute for long-term recognition of rights.